Before we begin tonight, I need you to do something. Take a moment to notice where you are right now. Check what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're here to listen to this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others find these cases that need to be heard. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a young man who left his university dormitory one November evening in 2019, drove into the remote wilderness of British Columbia, and vanished. A case that began with a burning truck on a desolate highway and has spiraled into one of Canada's most baffling missing person investigations. This is the story of Marshall Iwasa. Marshall J. Iwasa was born on June 5, 1996, in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He grew up in a close-knit family of Japanese-Canadian heritage, with parents who valued education, hard work, and family bonds. Marshall was the kind of son parents dream of having. Responsible, intelligent, kind-hearted, with a quiet determination to make something of his life. Marshall attended high school in Calgary, where he was known as a good student, though not one who sought attention or accolades. He was reserved, thoughtful, the kind of person who observed more than he spoke. His friends described him as loyal, trustworthy, someone you could count on. He had a love of gaming, like many young men his age. He enjoyed strategy games, role-playing games, the kind that require patience and planning. He was methodical in his approach to problems, whether in games or in life. After graduating high school, Marshall made the decision to pursue higher education. In the fall of 2019, at 23 years old, he enrolled at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia. Kamloops is a city of about 100,000 people, situated in the interior of British Columbia, where the North and South Thompson Rivers meet. It's surrounded by mountains and wilderness, beautiful but remote. Marshall was studying at TRU, living in residence on campus. It was his first semester there, a fresh start in a new city. He was pursuing his education with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else in his life. By November 2019, Marshall had been at TRU for a few months. He was adjusting to university life, making the transition from living at home to living independently. He kept in regular contact with his family in Calgary, as he always had. He was close to his parents, to his sister. They spoke frequently. Marshall drove a blue 2019 Nissan Rogue. It was a relatively new vehicle, reliable, the kind of practical choice a sensible young man would make. He used it to get around Kamloops, to make the occasional trip back to Calgary to visit family. On November 17, 2019, Marshall was last seen at his residence at Thompson Rivers University. It was a Sunday evening. The fall semester was in full swing. Exams were approaching. It was a busy time for students. Marshall left his residence that evening. He got into his blue Nissan Rogue and drove away from campus. He told no one where he was going. He left no note. He made no phone calls to family or friends explaining his departure. He simply left, and he was never seen again. When Marshall didn't return to his residence that night, no one immediately noticed. University students keep irregular hours. They come and go. It's not unusual for a student to be absent from their dorm for a night or even several days. But as Monday became Tuesday, and Tuesday became Wednesday, and there was still no sign of Marshall, people began to notice. He wasn't attending classes. He wasn't responding to messages. His absence was becoming conspicuous. By November 21st, for days after Marshall was last seen, concern had turned to worry. His family in Calgary, who normally heard from Marshall regularly, hadn't been able to reach him. His phone went straight to voicemail. His social media accounts showed no activity. On November 22nd, Marshall's family filed a missing person report with the Kamloops RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Marshall Iwasa, a 23-year-old university student, was officially missing. But even as the missing person report was being filed, Marshall's vehicle had already been found, and the circumstances of its discovery would turn this from a simple missing person case into something far more troubling. On November 19th, 2 days after Marshall was last seen, a motorist traveling along Highway 5, the Coquihalla Highway, noticed a vehicle pulled off onto a remote forestry service road. The vehicle appeared to be abandoned. More concerning, it looked like it had been burned. The motorist reported it to authorities. RCMP officers responded to the location, which was near Pemberton, British Columbia, roughly 250 kilometers southwest of Kamloops. It's a remote area, mountainous, heavily forested. The kind of place where you can go miles without seeing another human being. The vehicle was Marshall's blue 2019 Nissan Rogue, but it was no longer blue. Fire had blackened the exterior. The interior was badly damaged by flames and smoke. The location where the vehicle was found is significant. It was pulled off Highway 5 onto a forestry service road known as Pemberton Meadows Road or Forestry Service Road 40. This wasn't a main road. It wasn't somewhere you'd end up by accident. You had to deliberately turn off the highway and drive down this rough, unpaved road to reach the spot where the Nissan was found. The vehicle had been there for at least a day or two before being discovered, possibly longer. The fire had burned out on its own, leaving behind a scorched shell. When investigators first examined the vehicle, they were unsure whether it was connected to any crime or missing person case. Abandoned, burned vehicles unfortunately turn up from time to time, usually stolen and torched by joyriders or criminals trying to destroy evidence. But there were aspects of this scene that didn't fit the typical pattern. When the RCMP processed Marshall's burned Nissan Rogue, what they found was both revealing and deeply puzzling. First, the fire itself. The vehicle had burned, but not completely. It wasn't the kind of total destruction you'd expect from a vehicle fire started with accelerant. Instead, it appeared the fire had started in the interior, possibly from the dashboard area, and had burned for a time before extinguishing itself. Fire investigation experts examined the patterns. Their conclusion was that the fire was likely deliberately set, but in a way that suggested either inexperience or perhaps an intention for the fire to burn incompletely. Inside the vehicle, despite the fire damage, several items were found intact or partially intact. Marshall's personal belongings. His laptop computer, damaged by fire but not destroyed. His wallet, containing his identification and bank cards. His phone, also fire damaged but potentially recoverable. This was unusual. If someone had wanted to completely destroy evidence, why not ensure the fire consumed everything? Why leave identifying items in the vehicle? More troubling were the physical findings. There appeared to be blood evidence in the vehicle. Not large quantities, but enough to be concerning. Was it Marshall's blood? Had he been injured? Had someone else been injured in the vehicle? The RCMP seized the vehicle and transported it to a secure facility for detailed forensic examination. Every inch was photographed, documented, analyzed. Samples were taken for DNA analysis. The fire damage was assessed. The mechanical condition of the vehicle was evaluated to determine if there had been any malfunction that might explain why it was abandoned. What became clear was that this was not a simple case of a vehicle breakdown or a student deciding to abandon his car. The deliberate fire, the remote location, the presence of blood evidence, all pointed to something more sinister. But where was Marshall? Search and rescue teams were deployed to the area around where the vehicle was found. Dogs were brought in to track any scent. Helicopters surveyed the rugged terrain. Ground teams hiked through the forest, searching for any sign of Marshall or evidence of what had happened. The area around Pemberton is unforgiving wilderness. Dense forest, steep mountainsides, cold rivers, wildlife including bears and cougars. In November, temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Snow was already present at higher elevations. If Marshall was out there, injured or disoriented, his chances of survival decreased with each passing day. The searches continued for weeks. Volunteers joined professional search teams. Marshall's family traveled from Calgary to Pemberton, desperate to help, to do something, to find their son and brother. They found nothing. No trace of Marshall. No clothing. No footprints. No indication of which direction he might have gone from the vehicle. It was as if he'd vanished into the wilderness like smoke. As the investigation progressed, Detectives focused on reconstructing Marshall's movements on November 17th and the days following. Marshall had left his residence at Thompson Rivers University on the evening of November 17th. From Kamloops to where his vehicle was found near Pemberton is approximately 250 kilometers, about a 3-hour drive under normal conditions. The route would have taken him south and west from Kamloops, through increasingly remote terrain. Highway 5, the Coquihalla, is a major route, but once you leave the main highway for Forestry Service roads, you're in true wilderness. Investigators tried to determine if Marshall had stopped anywhere along the route. They checked surveillance footage from gas stations, rest stops, anywhere that might have cameras. They found no confirmed sightings of Marshall or his vehicle making the journey. This raised questions. Had Marshall driven directly from Kamloops to the location where his vehicle was found? Had he stopped somewhere else first? Had he met someone? Marshall's phone records were analyzed. His phone had gone offline sometime in the late evening of November 17th or early morning of November 18th. The last cell tower his phone pinged was somewhere between Kamloops and Pemberton, consistent with him being on the move. But the phone data couldn't pinpoint exactly where he'd been when the phone went offline. His bank records showed no activity after November 17th. He hadn't withdrawn money, hadn't made purchases. His accounts remained untouched. His social media accounts, which he'd used regularly, went silent. No posts, no messages, no activity. It was as if Marshall Iwasa had simply ceased to exist on the evening of November 17, 2019. Detectives interviewed Marshall's friends, classmates, professors. Had Marshall seemed troubled, depressed, anxious? Had he mentioned any plans to go anywhere? Had he talked about meeting anyone? Everyone said the same thing: Marshall had seemed fine. Perhaps a bit stressed about schoolwork, as any student would be approaching exams, but nothing out of the ordinary. He hadn't mentioned any plans for that weekend. He hadn't said anything about leaving Kamloops. His family was equally baffled. They'd spoken to Marshall regularly. He'd seemed happy, adjusting well to university life. He'd mentioned coming home to Calgary for Christmas break, which was just weeks away. He was looking forward to it. Nothing in Marshall's behavior suggested he was planning to drive to a remote forestry road and disappear. As weeks turned into months with no sign of Marshall, theories about what happened began to emerge. The first theory, the one that often arises in cases of young people who disappear, was suicide. Had Marshall been struggling with mental health issues he'd hidden from family and friends? Had the pressures of university life, being away from home, dealing with adult responsibilities become too much? The remote location, the burned vehicle, the lack of any trail to follow, could all be consistent with someone who wanted to end their life and not be found. But Marshall's family rejected this theory completely. They knew their son. They'd spoken to him days before his disappearance. There had been no warning signs, no indication of despair or hopelessness. Marshall had plans, things he was looking forward to. And if it had been suicide, where was his body? The extensive searches of the area had found nothing. The wilderness is vast, but the searchers had been thorough. Another theory focused on the possibility of an accident. Perhaps Marshall had driven to that remote location for some reason, had an accident, wandered away from his vehicle confused or injured, and succumbed to the elements in the wilderness. But this theory had problems too. Why would Marshall drive to such a remote location? And it didn't explain the deliberately set fire in his vehicle. A third theory, the one that investigators increasingly focused on, was foul play. Someone had harmed Marshall, either killed him or abducted him, and had burned his vehicle to destroy evidence. But who would want to harm Marshall? He had no known enemies. He wasn't involved in drugs or criminal activity. He didn't have conflicts with anyone. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, responsible young man living an unremarkable university student's life. Some investigators wondered if Marshall had been the victim of a random crime. Perhaps he'd stopped to help someone on the road, or had been carjacked, or had encountered someone with violent intentions. British Columbia's wilderness areas, particularly remote highways and forestry roads, had seen violent crimes before. In 2019, the same year Marshall disappeared, Another case had gripped British Columbia. Two tourists, China Dees and Lucas Fowler, had been murdered along the Alaska Highway in northern BC. Their killer, Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski, had gone on to kill a third victim, Leonard Dyke, before taking their own lives. The cases had shocked the province and highlighted the dangers that could lurk on remote highways. Could Marshall have encountered similar danger? Had he crossed paths with someone violent on that November evening? Investigators looked into this possibility but found no evidence connecting Marshall's case to any other crimes in the area. For Marshall's family, the investigation moved too slowly, with too few answers. His parents, Tammy and Jay Iwasa, his sister, and extended family members refused to simply wait and hope. They became active participants in the search for Marshall. They traveled to British Columbia repeatedly, organizing their own search parties, distributing flyers, conducting interviews with media, doing everything they could to keep Marshall's case in the public eye. Tammy Iwasa became the public face of the family's efforts. She appeared on local and national news programs, pleading for information, for anyone who might have seen Marshall or his vehicle to come forward. She described her son, his character, his dreams, trying to make the public understand that he was a real person, someone's child, someone who mattered. The family created a website and social media pages dedicated to finding Marshall. They raised funds for private searches and investigation efforts. They consulted with private investigators, with experts in missing person cases, with anyone who might offer insights the official investigation hadn't considered. They organized ground searches of the area where Marshall's vehicle had been found, sometimes with professional search and rescue teams, sometimes with volunteers who'd been moved by Marshall's story and wanted to help. The terrain was brutal. Steep hills, dense underbrush, fallen logs, rocky outcroppings. The area was home to black bears, which could be dangerous, especially if you surprised them. The weather in winter was harsh, with snow and freezing temperatures. But Marshall's family didn't stop. They searched in every season, through snow and rain and heat. They walked hundreds of kilometers of forestry roads and trails. They looked in ravines and near water sources. They searched anywhere Marshall might have gone, voluntarily or otherwise. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing. Not a footprint. Not a single trace. The RCMP continued their investigation, but as time passed, resources shifted to other cases. Marshall's file remained open, but the active investigation decreased in intensity. This is the terrible reality of missing person cases. Without new leads, without new evidence, investigations reach a point of diminishing returns. Detectives can only follow the leads they have, and when those leads run out, there's little they can do but wait for new information to surface. For families, this waiting is torture. Every day that passes is another day their loved one is missing, possibly suffering, possibly dead. The not knowing is a special kind of agony. In 2021, 2 years after Marshall disappeared, the RCMP announced they were treating his disappearance as suspicious, potentially criminal. This wasn't surprising given the circumstances, but it formalized what many had believed from the start. Something bad had happened to Marshall Iwasa. As of today, more than 5 years after Marshall Iwasa disappeared, his case remains unsolved. He has never been found. No one has been arrested or charged in connection with his disappearance. The RCMP investigation continues, but publicly, there have been few developments. Marshall would be 28 years old now if he's still alive, but no one who knows the case believes he is. The evidence, such as it exists, points to Marshall having died on or shortly after November 17, 2019. But how? And why? And where is he? These questions haunt everyone connected to the case. His family most of all, but also the investigators who've worked on it, the search and rescue volunteers who've combed the wilderness looking for him, the community members who've followed the case and hoped for resolution. There are aspects of Marshall's case that remain puzzling even after years of investigation. The route he took from Kamloops to Pemberton. Why that particular location? Had someone told him to go there? Had he gone there to meet someone? Or was the location chosen after whatever happened to Marshall had already happened? The fire in his vehicle. Who set it? If Marshall was already dead or incapacitated, Who burned the vehicle and why? If Marshall himself said it, why? What would be the purpose? The blood evidence found in the vehicle. Forensic analysis confirmed it was human blood, but the RCMP has never publicly disclosed whose blood it was or how much was present. This silence suggests the blood is part of the investigative strategy, information being held back deliberately. Over the years, tips have come into the RCMP. Possible sightings, theories from armchair detectives, psychics claiming to know where Marshall is. Each tip is evaluated, the credible ones investigated. None have led to Marshall. The RCMP has stated they believe someone knows what happened to Marshall. Whether that's someone directly involved in his disappearance or someone who has information they haven't shared, investigators are confident that the answers exist somewhere. They've appealed to conscience, to the possibility that relationships change, that people who were once loyal to someone might no longer feel that loyalty. They've emphasized that even small pieces of information could be crucial. But so far, no one has come forward with the information that would crack this case open. Marshall's family continues their vigil. They return to British Columbia regularly to search. They maintain their website and social media presence. They give interviews when media outlets show interest. Did he seek out danger deliberately, hoping for exactly what he got? Or was he simply an old man chasing one last adventure, one last glimpse of the chaos and violence that had defined his youth? We can't know his true intentions. We can only observe that the outcome, whatever his intentions, created exactly the kind of mystery he would have appreciated. The writer who documented the darkness vanished into it, leaving behind only questions and speculation. His work ensures he's remembered. His disappearance ensures he's remembered mysteriously, dramatically, in a way that reinforces the themes of his writing. In death or disappearance, Ambrose Bierce became one of his own characters. More than a century has passed since Ambrose Bierce walked into Mexico and vanished. Everyone who knew him personally is long dead. The Mexican Revolution ended in 1920, with thousands of its participants taking their memories to their graves. Yet the mystery of Bierce's disappearance continues to fascinate. Books have been written about it, documentaries produced. Researchers continue to pursue leads, however cold they might be. In 2004, nearly 90 years after Bierce disappeared, an American archaeologist claimed to have discovered evidence that Bierce had been killed at the Battle of Ojinaga and buried in a mass grave. Excavations were planned, but ultimately nothing concrete emerged. In 2013, on the centennial of Bierce's disappearance, renewed interest in the case led to fresh investigations in Mexico. Researchers combed through archives that had been inaccessible for decades. They interviewed descendants of revolutionaries, hoping for family stories that might provide clues. Again, nothing definitive emerged. The reality is that Ambrose Bierce's fate will almost certainly never be known. Too much time has passed. Too many people who might have known something are dead. Too many records are lost or destroyed. The physical evidence, if it ever existed, is long gone. What we're left with is the mystery itself, and the man's work. Bierce's writing remains in print more than a century after his disappearance. New generations of readers discover an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge in anthologies and classrooms. His cynical wisdom in The Devil's Dictionary resonates. His Civil War stories remain powerful depictions of combat and its psychological toll. He influenced generations of writers who came after him. His economical prose style, his willingness to confront dark subjects, his refusal to sentimentalize or romanticize death, all became hallmarks of modern American literature. Would Bierce be as remembered, as celebrated, if he died in bed in Washington, D.C. in 1920 at age 78? Possibly. His work stands on its own merits, but the mystery of his disappearance adds something. It makes him more than just a great writer. It makes him a figure of legend, a man who walked into the darkness he'd spent his life writing about and never returned. Whether that was his intention or simply the random outcome of a dangerous journey, the effect is the same. Ambrose Bierce achieved in death what few writers achieve in life. He became one of his own stories. Ambrose Bierce was 71 years old when he disappeared in Mexico in late 1913 or early 1914. He would be over 150 years old if he were somehow still alive today. Obviously, he's not. Ambrose Bierce died in Mexico, most likely within days or weeks of his last letter from Chihuahua. How he died, we'll never know for certain. Where he's buried, if he's buried at all, remains a mystery. Whether his death was violent or peaceful, quick or lingering, is lost to history. What remains is his work, his words, the corpus of stories and essays and definitions that secured his place in American literature. And what remains is the mystery itself, the unanswered questions about those final weeks in revolutionary Mexico. For a writer who spent his career exploring death, mystery, and the darkness of human existence, it's a fitting legacy. The man who wrote An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, who defined alone as in bad company, who survived being shot in the head during the Civil War only to document death for the next 50 years, vanished into the chaos he'd always been drawn to. Perhaps that was exactly what he wanted. Perhaps his disappearance in Mexico was his final piece of writing, composed not with words but with his life itself. A period at the end of a long, dark, brilliant sentence. Or perhaps it was simply bad luck, an old man in the wrong place at the wrong time, victim of the violence he'd survived so many times before. Either way, Ambrose Bierce is gone, vanished into the pages of history, leaving behind only his work and the enduring question: what happened to him in Mexico? If this story has intrigued you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Ambrose Bierce's story. Keep the mystery alive, even as we acknowledge it will likely never be solved. Thank you for listening tonight, and for remembering Ambrose Bierce, the writer who documented death so brilliantly that he became its most famous mystery. Story 3. Before we begin tonight, take a moment. Notice where you are, what time it is in your part of the world. Leave me a comment below with your location and the time. And if you're here to listen to this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a series of brutal attacks that terrorized a small border town in 1946. A phantom killer who struck on moonlit nights, who wore a white hood, who vanished without being caught. A case that inspired films and legends but has never been solved. This is the story of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. Texarkana is a unique place. It's not quite one city but two cities that share a name and a border. Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas sit on opposite sides of State Line Avenue, the street that marks the boundary between the two states. You can stand with 1 foot in Texas and 1 foot in Arkansas, quite literally straddling the state line. In 1946, the combined population of both Texarkanas was around 60,000 people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where teenagers could drive to lovers' lanes on the outskirts of town without their parents worrying about their safety. World War II had just ended. Young men were returning home from Europe and the Pacific. The country was settling back into peacetime routines. There was optimism in the air, a sense that the worst was behind America, that the future would be bright. In Texarkana, spring came early in 1946. By late February, the weather was mild enough for young couples to park on quiet roads outside of town, to sit in their cars and talk and kiss under the stars. It was innocent, the kind of courtship that had happened in small towns across America for generations. On the night of February 22, 1946, two such couples were parked on different lovers' lanes near Texarkana. They were about to discover that their small, safe town was not as safe as they believed. February 22, 1946. Friday night. Jimmy Hollis, 25 years old, and his girlfriend Mary Jean Larry, 19, were parked on a secluded road on the Texas side of Texarkana. It was around midnight. They were sitting in Jimmy's car, talking, enjoying the mild evening. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the driver's side window. The figure shone a flashlight into the car, blinding Jimmy. Before either of them could react, the figure opened the car door and ordered them out at gunpoint. The attacker was wearing a white hood over his head with holes cut out for eyes. The hood covered his face completely, making identification impossible. What happened next was brutal and terrifying. The hooded man beat Jimmy with the barrel of his pistol, striking him repeatedly in the head. Then he turned to Mary Jean. He sexually assaulted her with the barrel of the gun, beat her savagely, and then fled into the darkness. Both victims survived, though they were badly injured. They managed to get help and report the attack to police. Their descriptions of the attacker were limited. A white hood, average height and build. Nothing distinctive. He could have been anyone. Police treated it as a serious assault but didn't have much to go on. The attacker had left no physical evidence. The hood had ensured he couldn't be identified. Without leads, there was little detectives could do but hope the attacker didn't strike again. 3 weeks later, on March 24, 1946, he did. Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly and Moore, 17, were found dead in Griffin's car on a rural road about 10 miles from where the first attack had occurred. Both had been shot in the back of the head execution style. The car had been moved after the murders, possibly to delay discovery of the bodies. The connection to the February attack wasn't immediately obvious. These victims had been killed, not just beaten. The method was different. But the location, the targeting of young couples in parked cars, suggested a possible link. Texarkana police began to realize they might have a serial attacker on their hands. The murder of Richard Griffin and Polly and Moore sent shockwaves through Texarkana. A beating was one thing. Murder was another entirely. Two young people, on what should have been a pleasant evening, executed by an unknown killer who'd vanished without a trace. Police increased patrols of lovers' lanes and rural roads. They warned young couples to stay in populated areas, to avoid parking in secluded spots. But fear was already spreading through the community. 3 weeks after the Griffin-Moore murders, on April 14, 1946, the killer struck again. Paul Martin, 16, and Betty Jo Booker, 15, were on a date. Paul had borrowed his father's car. They'd been to a party earlier in the evening. Around midnight, they decided to drive home, taking a route that passed through farmland on the outskirts of Texarkana. They never made it home. Paul's body was found the next morning on a rural road about 5 miles from town. He'd been shot multiple times. Betty Jo's body was discovered several hours later, about 2 miles from where Paul had been found. She'd been shot in the back and in the face. Her saxophone, which she'd had with her because she'd been planning to practice, was found near her body. The brutality of these murders exceeded the previous attacks. Both victims were just teenagers. Betty Jo had apparently tried to run, had been chased down and executed. The killer had shown no mercy. Texarkana descended into panic. Parents forbade their children from going out at night. Gun sales skyrocketed. People who'd never locked their doors began barricading themselves inside after dark. The town that had felt safe just 2 months earlier now felt under siege. And the killer, whoever he was, had established a pattern. He attacked approximately every 3 weeks. He targeted young couples in cars. He struck at night, preferably when the moon was full or nearly full, giving him enough light to see but not so much that he'd be easily spotted. He was methodical, efficient, and seemingly unstoppable. The press began calling him the Phantom Killer or the Phantom Slayer. The name stuck. By late April 1946, Texarkana was a town transformed by fear. Streets that had been busy in the evenings were now deserted. Businesses closed early. The annual spring festival was canceled. Life as people had known it had stopped. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. Local police, sheriffs from both Texas and Arkansas, Texas Rangers, even FBI agents descended on Texarkana. Hundreds of men were interviewed. Suspects were questioned and released. Tips poured in, each one investigated, none leading anywhere. The killer seemed to be one step ahead. He left no fingerprints, no physical evidence that could identify him. The only descriptions came from the survivors of the first attack, and those descriptions were vague. A man of average build wearing a white hood. 3 weeks after the Martin Booker murders, on May 3, 1946, the killer struck for what would be the last time. But this attack was different. Virgil Starks, 37, was sitting in his living room in his farmhouse about 10 miles outside Texarkana. His wife Katie was in another room. It was around 10:30 at night. Without warning, bullets began crashing through the windows. Virgil was hit twice in the back of the head and died instantly. Katie, hearing the shots and seeing her husband fall, ran for help. She was shot twice in the face and in the jaw but survived. The Phantom had changed his pattern. Instead of attacking couples in cars, he'd attacked a couple in their home. Instead of using a pistol at close range, he'd used a rifle from outside the house. The change suggested either escalation or perhaps opportunity, a target of convenience rather than the carefully chosen couples in isolated locations. Katie Stark survived and was able to provide some information to police. She'd heard footsteps outside, had seen a shadow at the window, but she hadn't seen the attacker's face, couldn't provide a useful description. Police found shoe prints outside the Starks' farmhouse and a bloody flashlight that the killer had apparently dropped. But forensic science in 1946 was primitive. The evidence didn't lead anywhere, and then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. In the weeks and months following the Starks attack, the investigation into the Phantom Killer became one of the most intensive manhunts in Texas history. Over 400 suspects were interviewed. Polygraph tests were administered. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued. One suspect stood out, Yowell Swinney, a career criminal with a history of theft and violence. Swinney had been in the Texarkana area during the time of the murders. His wife told police that he'd confessed the murders to her, though she later recanted the statement. Police believed they had their man, but there was a problem. No physical evidence linked Swinney to any of the crimes. His wife's testimony, which she'd recanted, wouldn't be enough for a conviction. Without evidence, prosecutors knew they couldn't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Swinney was eventually sent to prison on car theft charges, ensuring he'd be off the streets. If he was the Phantom Killer, his imprisonment would explain why the attacks stopped. But he was never charged with the murders, never tried, never convicted. Was Yowell Swinney the Phantom Killer? Many investigators believed he was. The timing of his imprisonment coinciding with the end of the attacks seemed too convenient to be coincidental. But belief is not proof, and Swinney maintained his innocence until his death in 1994. Other suspects were investigated over the years. A railroad worker who'd been in the area, a disturbed young man who fit the physical description, even a respected businessman who some believed had a dark secret life. But none of these suspects panned out either. The case went cold. Decades passed. The survivors and the families of the victims aged. Some died, taking their memories and their pain with them. Texarkana slowly returned to normal, though the murders left a permanent scar on the community's psyche. The Phantom Killer was never caught. The case was never solved. Justice was never served for the victims. The Texarkana Moonlight murders left an indelible mark on American crime history. In 1976, 30 years after the attacks, a film called The Town That Dreaded Sundown dramatized the case. The movie took liberties with the facts but captured the fear that had gripped Texarkana in 1946. The case has been featured in countless true crime books, television programs, and podcasts. It remains one of the most famous unsolved serial killer cases in American history, alongside the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. Why was the Phantom never caught? Several factors contributed. Forensic science in 1946 was rudimentary. DNA testing didn't exist. Crime scene investigation techniques we take for granted today hadn't been developed. The killer left no usable physical evidence. The jurisdictional issues didn't help. The crimes occurred in both Texas and Arkansas, requiring coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Communication between agencies in 1946 was slower, more cumbersome than today, and the killer himself was careful. He planned his attacks. He wore a disguise. He chose locations where he could approach and escape without being seen. He was methodical and disciplined. After the Starks attack, he stopped. Whether this was because Yowell Swinney was imprisoned, or because the killer moved away or died, or simply decided he'd pushed his luck far enough, we don't know. What we do know is that 8 people were attacked in Texarkana between February and May 1946. 5 of them died. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The town itself was traumatized, its innocence shattered. The Phantom Killer, whoever he was, achieved what serial killers seek. He created terror, he exercised power over others, he became infamous, and he got away with it. The last survivor of the Texarkana Moonlight murders has now passed away. Everyone who lived through that spring of terror in 1946 is gone. The Phantom Killer himself, whether it was Yowell Swinney or someone else, is certainly dead. But the case remains unsolved. The files remain open in police archives in both Texas and Arkansas. Occasionally, someone claims to have new evidence or a new theory. These are investigated and, so far, none have changed the fundamental reality. We don't know with certainty who the Phantom Killer was. The 5 people who died, Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, and Virgil Starks, deserve to be remembered. Their lives were cut short by senseless violence. Their families suffered losses that could never be repaired. Texarkana recovered, as communities do, but it was changed as any place touched by such evil is changed. The fear has faded with time, but the memory remains. Somewhere, possibly in a forgotten grave, lies the Phantom Killer. His identity known only to him, his crimes unpunished except perhaps by whatever conscience he possessed. If this story has affected you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the story of the Texarkana Moonlight murders. Remember the victims. Keep the case alive. Thank you for listening tonight. They refused to let Marshall's case fade into obscurity, because Marshall Iwasa was not just a case file number. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, with dreams and plans and people who loved him. He deserves to be found. His family deserves answers. The disappearance of Marshall Iwasa represents everything that's frustrating and heartbreaking about unsolved missing person cases. There is evidence. The burned vehicle, the remote location, the blood, the digital trail that ends abruptly. But the evidence doesn't tell a complete story. It offers tantalizing glimpses of what might have happened without providing definitive answers. Someone knows something, whether it's the person or persons directly responsible for Marshall's disappearance, or someone who saw something, heard something, or was told something. Somewhere there is information that could solve this case. The RCMP continues to accept tips. If you have any information about Marshall Iwasa's disappearance, no matter how insignificant it might seem, they want to hear from you. Tips can be provided anonymously. After 5 years, loyalties shift. Circumstances change. What someone couldn't say in 2019 or 2020 might be possible to say now. For Marshall's family, especially his mother Tammy, who has become the voice for Marshall in his absence, the search will never end until he's found. They've said they won't stop looking, won't stop hoping, won't stop fighting for their son and brother until they have answers. Marshall deserves to be found. He deserves to be brought home. His family deserves to know what happened to him that November night in 2019 when he drove away from his university dormitory and into the wilderness. Somewhere in the mountains and forests of British Columbia, Marshall Iwasa's remains likely rest. Somewhere, answers wait to be uncovered. Somewhere, someone holds the key to solving this mystery. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Marshall's story. Keep his case in the public consciousness. Sometimes, that continued attention is what finally brings forward the witness or the tip that solves a case. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Marshall Iwasa, the young man who drove into the wilderness and never came home. Story 2. Before we begin our journey tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look around you. Notice what time it is where you are. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these mysteries that deserve to be remembered. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about one of America's greatest writers, a man who survived the Civil War, who wrote some of the most cynical and brilliant prose of his generation, who documented death and darkness with unflinching honesty. A man who, at the age of 71, walked into revolution-torn Mexico and was never seen again. This is the story of Ambrose Bierce and his greatest mystery. Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce was born on June 24, 1842, in Meigs County, Ohio, the 10th of 13 children in a family of modest means. His parents were religious, strict, and poor. His childhood was marked by hardship, by the kind of poverty that shapes a person's worldview permanently. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Ambrose was 18 years old. He enlisted in the Union Army, joining the 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment. This decision would define the rest of his life. Ambrose Bierce fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War: Shiloh, Chickamauga, Kennesaw Mountain. He saw death on an industrial scale, witnessed the casual brutality of war, the randomness of survival, the way men died meaninglessly in muddy fields far from home. At the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in 1864, Bierce was shot in the head. The bullet struck him in the temple, fracturing his skull. By all rights, he should have died. Countless men died from lesser wounds. But Ambrose survived, though the injury left him with lifelong headaches, episodes of dizziness, and possibly contributed to the dark cynicism that would characterize his later writing. He left the Army in 1865 with the rank of brevet major, having served with distinction for 4 years. But he carried the war with him always. It haunted his dreams, informed his writing, shaped his understanding of human nature and the universe's indifference to human suffering. After the war, Ambrose tried various occupations. He worked in the Treasury Department. He participated in a military expedition mapping territories in the American West. But his true calling emerged when he began writing. Ambrose Bierce became a journalist, a satirist, a short story writer. He moved to San Francisco in the 1870s, where he became part of the literary scene, earning a reputation for his caustic wit, his brilliant prose, and his absolute refusal to suffer fools or compromise his principles. His short stories were masterpieces of economy and horror. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge remains one of the most anthologized American short stories ever written. Chickamauga drew directly from his war experiences, depicting the horror of battle through the eyes of a child. His stories were dark, cynical, shot through with a worldview that saw death as the only certainty and life as a cruel joke. His journalism was equally biting. He wrote a column called The Devil's Dictionary, which offered sardonic definitions of common words. Faith, he wrote, was belief without evidence in what is told by one who speaks without knowledge of things without parallel. His wit was sharp enough to draw blood. By the early 1900s, Ambrose Bierce was a literary celebrity. His work appeared in major publications. He had published numerous collections of stories and essays. He was respected, feared, and widely read. But he was also alone. His marriage had failed. His 2 sons had died young, one by suicide, one from alcoholism-related illness. His daughter was distant. At 70 years old, Ambrose Bierce was a man who'd outlived most of his contemporaries, who'd seen too much death, who seemed tired of the world. In late 1913, Ambrose Bierce decided to take one final journey. In October 1913, Ambrose Bierce left Washington, D.C., where he'd been living, and began traveling south. He told friends and colleagues he was going to visit the Civil War battlefields where he'd fought half a century earlier. A pilgrimage of sorts, an old soldier returning to the scenes of his youth. He traveled through Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi. He visited Shiloh, where he'd nearly died in 1862. He walked the grounds of Chickamauga, where thousands had fallen in September 1863. He wrote letters to friends describing these visits, his prose as sharp as ever, his observations tinged with nostalgia and irony. But the battlefields weren't his final destination. They were a prelude. In late November or early December 1913, Ambrose Bierce crossed the border into Mexico. And it's here that our mystery truly begins. Mexico in 1913 was in chaos. The Mexican Revolution, which had begun in 1910 with the overthrow of longtime dictator Porfirio Diaz, was in full fury. Multiple factions were fighting for control of the country. Revolutionary leader Francisco Madero had been assassinated earlier in 1913. General Victoriano Huerta had seized power, but he faced opposition from various revolutionary forces, most notably Pancho Villa in the north and Emiliano Zapata in the south. The fighting was brutal. Summary executions were common. Civilians died alongside soldiers. Foreign nationals were sometimes caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily dangerous place for a 71-year-old American writer to be wandering. Yet this is exactly where Ambrose Bierce chose to go. Why? His stated reason was to observe the revolution firsthand. Bierce had always been fascinated by war, by violence, by the collision of order and chaos. The Mexican Revolution offered a chance to witness history being made, to see combat again, even if only as an observer. Some of his letters suggest he intended to attach himself to Pancho Villa's forces. Villa was one of the more colorful revolutionary leaders, a former bandit turned general, commanding the División del Norte in northern Mexico. Foreign journalists and adventurers were sometimes allowed to travel with Villa's army, and Bierce apparently sought to join them. But there may have been darker motivations. Some who knew Bierce believed he was going to Mexico to die. Not by disease or old age in a comfortable bed, but violently, dramatically, in a way befitting a man who'd spent his life documenting death and darkness. To be a gringo in Mexico, Bierce wrote to a friend, "Ah, that is euthanasia." Whether this was his characteristic dark humor or a genuine death wish, no one can say with certainty. What we know is that Ambrose Bierce entered Mexico in late 1913. His last known letter was dated December 26, 1913, written from the city of Chihuahua in northern Mexico. After that, silence. The letters Ambrose Bierce sent from Mexico in those final weeks of 1913 provide our only first-hand account of his journey and his state of mind. From San Antonio, Texas, before crossing into Mexico, he wrote to his secretary and close friend Carrie Christensen. He mentioned his plans to visit the battlefields, then continue into Mexico. His tone was matter-of-fact, practical, with the dark humor that characterized all his correspondence. Once in Mexico, his letters continued. He described the landscape, the poverty, the evidence of fighting everywhere. He wrote about meeting various revolutionary officers, about his efforts to connect with Pancho Villa's forces. In one letter, he wrote, "Civilization be dinged. It is the mountains and the desert for me." He seemed energized by the chaos, by the return to a world where violence and death were immediate realities rather than subjects for contemplation from a comfortable distance. His last known letter was sent from Chihuahua on December 26, 1913. In it, he mentioned his intention to travel with Villa's army to the city of Ojinaga, where a major battle was expected between Villa's forces and federal troops loyal to Huerta. The Battle of Ojinaga would indeed take place in early January 1914. It was a decisive victory for Villa's forces. Hundreds died in the fighting. Many federal soldiers and officers were executed after the battle. But whether Ambrose Bierce was present at Ojinaga, whether he witnessed the battle, whether he survived it or died in it, no one knows. After December 26, 1913, no more letters arrived from Ambrose Bierce. No telegrams. No communications of any kind. At first, this didn't alarm his friends and associates in the United States. Mail from revolutionary Mexico was unreliable. Communications were often delayed or lost entirely. It was entirely possible that Bierce had sent letters that simply never arrived. But as weeks became months, and months became years, and still no word came, people began to accept the obvious conclusion. Something had happened to Ambrose Bierce in Mexico. The question was, what? In the absence of concrete information about Ambrose Bierce's fate, theories proliferated. Some were plausible based on the realities of revolutionary Mexico. Others were fantastical, reflecting the mythic status Bierce had achieved in American letters. The most straightforward theory was that Bierce had been killed in battle or caught in crossfire. Revolutionary Mexico was extraordinarily dangerous. Thousands of people died in the fighting, many of them never identified, their bodies buried in mass graves or left where they fell. An elderly American journalist traveling with an army would have been at constant risk. If Bierce had been at the Battle of Ojinaga, or any of the other clashes that occurred in early 1914, he could easily have been killed. His body might have been buried hastily with others, never identified, never recorded in any official documentation. A variation of this theory suggested Bierce had been executed, possibly by federal forces who captured him, possibly by revolutionary forces who suspected him of being a spy. Summary executions were common on all sides of the Mexican Revolution. Bierce's status as a foreign national wouldn't necessarily have protected him. Another theory held that Bierce had died of natural causes. He was 71 years old with a history of health problems, including the lingering effects of his Civil War head wound. The rigors of travel in revolutionary Mexico, the poor conditions, the stress, could easily have killed him. If he died in some remote location, far from anyone who knew him, his body might never have been identified. Some theories were more dramatic. There were claims that Bierce had been murdered by Villa's forces after some disagreement or perceived insult. Pancho Villa was known for his violent temper. If Bierce had witnessed something Villa wanted kept secret, or had somehow offended the general, execution would have been swift. Other theories suggested Bierce had faked his own death, that the Mexico trip was an elaborate ruse to disappear permanently. According to this theory, Bierce had grown tired of his life, his fame, the burden of being Ambrose Bierce. He'd planned his disappearance carefully, using the chaos of revolutionary Mexico as cover to vanish and start a new life elsewhere, perhaps in South America. This theory is romantic but implausible. Bierce was 71. He had limited resources. Starting a new life in a foreign country with no documentation, no support system while trying to avoid detection would have been extraordinarily difficult even for a younger man. Some of the more outlandish theories had Bierce joining Villa's forces permanently, fighting and dying as a soldier, or fleeing to Europe, or being murdered for mysterious reasons unrelated to the revolution. These theories lacked evidence but persisted because they made for good stories. The reality is probably more mundane and more tragic. Ambrose Bierce, an elderly man with health problems, traveled into one of the most dangerous regions on Earth at one of the most violent periods in its history. The most likely explanation is that he died there, victim of violence or disease or simply the physical demands of the journey, and his body was never recovered or identified. But the absence of a body of any definitive evidence of his death left room for speculation. And speculation, once started, is hard to stop. In the years immediately following Bierce's disappearance, various people attempted to discover what had happened to him. His daughter Helen hired investigators to search for information in Mexico. The U.S. State Department made inquiries through diplomatic channels. Journalists pursued leads and interviewed revolutionaries who might have encountered Bierce. All came up empty. No one could definitively place Bierce at any specific location after Chihuahua in late December 1913. Some claimed to have seen him in various places, but these accounts were vague, often contradictory, and impossible to verify. One frequently cited account came from a man named T.F. Turner, who claimed that Bierce had died during the siege of Ojinaga in January 1914. According to Turner, Bierce had been with Villa's forces and was killed during the battle, his body buried in a mass grave with other casualties. But Turner's account came years after the fact and couldn't be corroborated. He provided no physical evidence, no witnesses, nothing that would definitively confirm Bierce had been at Ojinaga at all. Other supposed witnesses came forward over the years, each with their own story about Bierce's fate. He'd been executed by firing squad. He died of fever in a rebel camp. He'd been killed by federal troops. He'd lived for months or even years in Mexico before dying. None of these accounts proved reliable. Most were probably fabrications, people seeking attention or money by claiming knowledge of a famous man's death. Some may have been genuine cases of mistaken identity, people who'd encountered an elderly American in Mexico and assumed it was Bierce. The Mexican Revolution itself made investigation difficult. Records were poor or non-existent. Thousands of people died without documentation. The chaos of war obliterated evidence. Even if Bierce had been killed and buried in an official grave, the records might have been lost or destroyed. By the 1920s, most people accepted that Ambrose Bierce was dead, though exactly when, where, and how remained unknown. In 1931, 17 years after Bierce's disappearance, a California court officially declared him dead, with the date of death listed as December 26, 1913, the date of his last known letter. This was a legal necessity for settling his estate, but it provided no actual answers about his fate. Over the decades since, various researchers and Bierce enthusiasts have pursued the mystery. They've combed through Mexican archives, interviewed descendants of revolutionaries, followed every lead no matter how tenuous. Some claimed to have found evidence of Bierce's grave. Others insisted they'd discovered documentation of his execution. Each new claim was investigated and found wanting. The truth is that Ambrose Bierce vanished into the chaos of revolutionary Mexico, and the chaos consumed him completely. Ambrose Bierce's disappearance, while tragic for those who knew him, has become inseparable from his literary legacy. In a sense, it was the perfect ending for a writer who spent his career documenting death, mystery, and the darkness of human existence. Bierce wrote extensively about soldiers who vanished in war, about mysterious disappearances, about the thin line between life and death. His story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, deals with a man's final moments as he faces execution, with reality and illusion blurring until death comes. His entire body of work is suffused with themes of mortality, futility, and the ultimate meaninglessness of individual human life in the face of vast, impersonal forces. That he should vanish in exactly the way one of his characters might vanish, that his death should be mysterious and unverified, that he should leave no body, no final words beyond those cryptic letters from Mexico, seems almost too fitting to be coincidental. Some literary scholars have suggested that Bierce planned it this way, that his journey to Mexico was his final story, one he wrote with his life rather than his pen, that he chose to exit on his own terms, to deny the world the mundane reality of an old man dying in bed, to instead craft a disappearance that would become legend. There's evidence to support this interpretation. Bierce's letters before leaving for Mexico suggest a man settling his affairs, making preparations as if he didn't intend to return. He updated his will. He gave away possessions. He said goodbye to friends in ways that suggested finality. His comment about euthanasia in Mexico wasn't the only death-focused remark he made. He wrote to his niece, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it is a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs." This was either the dark humor of a man who'd faced death many times and had no fear of it, or it was something more. A man planning his own exit, choosing his method and manner of death. Did Ambrose Bierce go to Mexico intending to die?